a $500 fine for having a flower bed. The ink on the notice wasn't even dry before the Homeowners Association president smirked, thinking he had won. What he didn't know was that he had just picked a fight with a Supreme Court judge, and William Grant never lost. William Grant leaned against his porch railing, a crisp white notice clutched in his hand. His backyard, bathed in the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun, was nothing short of perfection. Manicured hedges stood like emerald sentinels, a neatly trimmed lawn stretched out like a plush green carpet, and a vibrant flower bed, overflowing with the crimson and blush roses his late wife had adored, was the centerpiece. And yet, this fine, this ridiculous demand, was the first greeting he received from the HOA. He turned his gaze toward the street, where a stocky man in a blindingly white polo shirt and khaki shorts strutted around as if he owned the entire block. Richard Langley, the HOA president, a man who wielded the homeowner's rulebook like a weapon, preying on anyone who dared to challenge his minuscule authority. He stood beside a gleaming white golf cart, a clipboard clutched in his beefy hand, issuing more citations to unsuspecting neighbors, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. William stepped off his porch, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the simmering anger within him. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the offending fine. "Mind explaining what this is all about?" Richard barely spared him a condescending glance before answering, "Unauthorized flower beds. Page 12 of the HOA Guidelines. Landscaping modifications require prior approval." William raised a questioning brow. "Flower beds require approval? Since when?" "Since always," Richard replied, tapping his clipboard with an air of finality. "It's standard practice. Got to keep the neighborhood uniform." "You should have read the rules before moving in." "I did," William said, his voice even, betraying none of the irritation he felt. "And there's nothing about flower beds requiring pre-approval." Richard chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "You a lawyer or something?" William let a small, knowing smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that." Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating arrogance. "Look, rules are rules. You can pay the fine or file an appeal, but I wouldn't waste your time." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if imparting a profound secret. "I never lose." William met his gaze unflinchingly, his eyes like chips of steel. "Is that so?" Richard smirked, a flash of triumph in his eyes. "It is." William nodded slowly, folding the fine neatly and tucking it into his pocket. "Good to know." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, William poured himself a generous glass of bourbon, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler. He sat at his mahogany desk, the scent of old leather and expensive paper filling the air, flipping through the HOA bylaws he had printed before moving in. His legal instincts, honed over decades on the bench, had been right. There was no rule about flower beds requiring pre-approval. But what intrigued him more were the inconsistencies, the blatant disregard for the very rules Richard so fiercely enforced on others. A pattern emerged: fines seemed to be arbitrarily levied, a tool to exert control rather than maintain community standards. His flower bed was an issue, but Richard's own overgrown hedges, reaching a good 4 feet above the allowed height, and his mismatched, faded mailbox weren't. A neighbor's American flag, proudly displayed but perhaps a tad too large, had earned a hefty fine, while another's collection of garish garden gnomes, a veritable plastic army, went untouched. William leaned back in his plush leather chair, a familiar thrill coursing through him. It had been a while since he felt the tug of a real intellectual challenge, the kind that had defined his career. The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when William made a casual stop at Richard's house. He noted with a touch of amusement the multiple violations visible right from the sidewalk. "Morning, Richard," William greeted, holding up his steaming mug of coffee. Richard, halfway into his golf cart, a look of annoyance clouding his features, frowned. "Something I can do for you, Grant?" "Thought I'd take your advice," William said with a disarming smile. "Read the rulebook." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Seems like a few things are unevenly enforced. Richard's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. What are you getting at? Just that your hedges are a good foot too tall, according to Section 3.5, Williams said, his voice laced with mock concern. Your mailbox isn't the HOA standard model, and that oil stain on your driveway should have earned you a fine weeks ago. Williams' eyes twinkled with mischief. Strange how these things go unnoticed, isn't it? Richard stiffened, his face turning a shade of red that matched Williams' roses. Are you threatening me? Not at all, Williams said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Just making an observation. Richard's smug expression wavered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. You don't want to start a war you can't win. William took another leisurely sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving Richard's. Oh, Richard, he said, his voice rich with amusement, you have no idea who you're dealing with. By noon, a new fine landed on Richard's doorstep, this time from his own HOA board. William leaned back in his office chair, watching through the window as Richard Langley stomped toward his golf cart, the fresh violation notice crumpled in his fist. The HOA president's usual smug demeanor had cracked, replaced with barely contained frustration. It was the first sign that William's subtle pushback had landed, and landed hard. A few hours later, William attended his first HOA meeting, walking into the bland, community clubhouse with quiet confidence. The room was filled with a mix of indifferent homeowners and a few who looked genuinely anxious. At the front sat Richard, flanked by the rest of the HOA board, three middle-aged yes-men who nodded in unison at whatever pronouncement Richard made. All right, Richard began, slamming his gavel onto the cheap laminate table with unnecessary force, a pathetic attempt to assert dominance. Next on the agenda, a violation dispute. Mr. Grant, you're here to contest your fine. William stood, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his perfectly tailored suit. Yes, and I'd like to begin by. Just to be clear, Richard cut in, flashing a condescending smile, this isn't a court of law, Judge. This is an HOA hearing. Different rules. A few people in the room snickered, but William merely raised an eyebrow. He'd seen this type before, men who mistook unchecked power for intelligence. I'm aware, Mr. Langley, Williams said calmly, his voice carrying a weight of authority that Richard's gavel banging couldn't match. But rules still matter. I've read the HOA bylaws, and nowhere does it say flower beds require pre-approval. Richard smirked, flipping open a well-worn folder. Page 12. All exterior modifications require prior approval. William raised a skeptical brow. That's clearly referring to major structural changes, such as fences, sheds, and patios. A flower bed is hardly a permanent structure. Agree to disagree. Richard said smugly, but the fine stands. William chuckled softly, a sound that held no humor. You're free to disagree. The law, however, is not. Richard's smirk faltered before he could respond. A woman from the audience, her voice filled with the weariness of dealing with Richard for too long, spoke up. Actually, he's right. I've lived here 10 years, and I've never had to ask permission for a flower bed. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Others nodded, sharing knowing glances. Richard's eyes flickered with annoyance. That's not up for discussion. The fine remains. He tapped his gavel again, the sound sharp and petulant. Next issue. William could see it now. This wasn't just arbitrary enforcement. This was intentional targeting. Richard thrived on power, picking on homeowners he perceived as weak, those who wouldn't fight back. Unfortunately for him, William Grant was not one of them. That evening, William began meticulously collecting evidence. He took detailed photos of Richard's own numerous violations, the overgrown hedges casting long shadows, the faded, peeling house paint, and the clearly unauthorized deck extension that stretched far beyond the property line. Then, he walked the neighborhood, speaking to other homeowners who had been unfairly fined, their voices hushed with years of intimidation. A disturbing pattern emerged. Richard targeted newcomers, those who spoke out against his decisions, while longtime residents within his inner circle were left alone, their own violations conveniently ignored. Some people had paid thousands of dollars in fines for minor infractions, while others with glaring violations were never even cited. The next day, Williams submitted a formal complaint against Richard to the HOA compliance officer, a man who clearly despised working under Richard's thumb and begrudgingly inspected the reported violations. By the afternoon, Richard received a $750 fine for non-compliant landscaping and other infractions. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet amusement, a collective sigh of relief rippling through the community. That evening, William relaxed on his porch, the scent of blooming roses filling the air as he sipped his bourbon. The peace was shattered when Richard stormed up his driveway, his face contorted with fury. "You think this is funny?" Richard spat, waving the violation notice like a weapon. William calmly set down his glass. "Not at all. Rules are rules, wouldn't you agree?" Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "You're making a mistake." William tilted his head slightly. "Because I'm following the rules?" Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "I run this HOA. If you keep pushing, I will make your life miserable." William's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "You already have, Richard. And that was your mistake." The next morning, William woke up to a veritable avalanche of fines, 6 in total. One for his perfectly standard mailbox, one for the color of his window trim which was the approved color, one for the height of his fence which met the regulations, another for a non-approved bird feeder, and 2 more for reasons so absurd he actually laughed out loud. This wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about control, pure and simple. Richard had just declared war. William sat at his desk, sipping his morning coffee, flipping through the fresh stack of violation notices with an amused smirk. Richard had gone nuclear, finding him for a bird feeder. The man was desperate. But desperation led to mistakes, and mistakes were what William thrived on. He turned to his laptop and opened the HOA's financial records. As a Supreme Court judge, he had seen his fair share of corruption, and something about Richard's HOA felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. Fines were meant to be a minor enforcement measure, not a full-scale revenue stream. Yet, based on homeowner complaints, Richard was handing out thousands of dollars in penalties. But where was that money going? Most HOAs used fine money for community maintenance, upkeep, repairs, landscaping. But looking around the neighborhood, where was the improvement? The roads had cracks wide enough to swallow a small car, the community pool had been closed for repairs for months, and the clubhouse looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Something wasn't adding up. William dug deeper, accessing the HOA's annual budget reports. His legal background allowed him to navigate financial documents with ease. After an hour of cross-referencing incoming fines versus reported expenses, his suspicions were confirmed. Over 40% of the collected fines were unaccounted for, tens of thousands of dollars missing. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Bingo! William wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. He was dealing with a thief. And that changed everything. That afternoon, William took another walk around the neighborhood, this time engaging in casual conversations with homeowners. Many had stories to share, tales of Richard's petty tyranny and exorbitant fines. One elderly couple had been fined $1,200 for a slightly off-white garage door. A single mother was forced to pay $500 for a non-compliant security camera, despite other homes having the exact same model. A military veteran had almost lost his home after being fined into financial hardship over yard debris, a single fallen branch. William documented everything, his legal mind piecing together the puzzle. Then, he paid a visit to a local investigative journalist he had worked with years ago. Langley, the journalist, Dan Matthews, said, raising an eyebrow as he leaned back in his chair. "I know that name. There was a small case years back. He was caught embezzling funds from a previous HOA but got off with a settlement." William's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile. Perfect. The next day, William put Phase 2 into action. He submitted an official request for HOA financial transparency, citing legal precedent. The HOA was legally required to provide a detailed breakdown of their finances to homeowners upon request. Richard, of course, refused, his response delivered with a sneer and another $1,000 fine for a visibly cracked driveway. William simply smiled, waiting for Richard to make his next, inevitable mistake. And Richard did. 2 nights later, under the cloak of darkness, Richard personally spray-painted William's driveway with fake cracks and then issued a fine for it the next morning. Unfortunately for Richard, William had security cameras. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Word had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People were fed up with Richard's reign of terror. Richard walked in wearing his usual smug expression, but there was a palpable tension in the air, a collective anger simmering just beneath the surface. William sat near the front, a thick folder resting on his lap. Richard cleared his throat, tapping his gavel with a nervous energy. Before we start, I want to address some concerns about fines. These rules exist for a reason, and homeowners need to. Actually, Richard, William interrupted, rising to his feet, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority, let's talk about your rules. Richard tensed, his face paling slightly. You don't have the floor, Grant. I do now, William said, his gaze unwavering. He pulled a stack of papers from his folder. I've compiled a detailed analysis of your financial records, and guess what? Over 40% of the collected HOA fines are missing. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. William continued, his voice rising slightly with righteous indignation, not only that, but your own numerous violations have gone unpunished for years. Your hedges are a foot too high, your deck extension is unauthorized, your driveway is stained. You fined residents thousands of dollars for utter nonsense while lining your own pockets. Richard turned a sickly shade of white. That's ridiculous. William smirked, a predatory glint in his eyes. Oh, and let's not forget this. He held up several clear, high-resolution photos of Richard, under the cover of night, spray-painting William's driveway. Gasps filled the room. Richard froze, caught red-handed. You vandalized my property to justify a fine? William said smoothly, his voice dripping with disdain. That's fraud, Richard. That's illegal. Richard bolted from the meeting, his face a mask of panic, but it was too late. By morning, the entire neighborhood knew the truth. By evening, so did the police. Richard Langley was a cornered animal, and William knew it. The moment the HOA president stormed out of the meeting, panic flashing across his face, William leaned back in his chair, listening to the rising murmur of angry homeowners around him. For years, Richard had ruled with an iron fist, bullying, fining, and manipulating his way to power. But now, the mask had shattered. By morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the explosive revelations, embezzled funds, fraudulent fines, and now, outright vandalism. William had all the proof he needed, meticulously documented and ready for the authorities. But now it was time for the finishing blow. Richard didn't back down easily. The next morning, William woke up to a certified letter from the HOA. He chuckled mirthlessly as he read the latest desperate maneuver, a final notice of foreclosure proceedings. Richard had weaponized one of the HOA's most aggressive tactics, threatening to foreclose on William's home over the mountain of fabricated unpaid fines. It was a classic bully move. If he couldn't win fairly, he tried to scare William into submission. Unfortunately for Richard, he had just made his final, most egregious mistake. By noon, William was seated at his desk, the sunlight glinting off his silver hair as he drafted an official lawsuit. He filed 2 cases, a civil lawsuit against Richard Langley personally for fraud, defamation, and damages, and a lawsuit against the HOA for violating homeowners' rights, financial mismanagement, and wrongful fines. Then, he made a single phone call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. State Attorney's Office. William smiled, a hint of steel in his voice. I have a case of HOA corruption that you might find interesting. That evening, William stepped onto his porch, the air cool and crisp, sipping a fresh glass of bourbon as the stars began to pepper the twilight sky. He checked his watch. Exactly 6:45 p.m. Richard's car screeched to a halt in his driveway. Showtime. Richard stormed up the walkway, his face a mask of fury, sweat beading on his forehead. He was unraveling. You think you're so smart? He spat, waving the foreclosure notice in his trembling hand. You think you can just waltz into my neighborhood and challenge me? William chuckled, taking a leisurely sip of his drink. Richard, this was never your neighborhood. You just acted like it was. And you're going to lose. I have the board. I have the rules. Richard hissed, his voice cracking with desperation. You're just a Supreme Court judge, William interrupted, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Richard flinched as if struck. William tossed a thick folder onto the porch table. You really should have done your homework before picking this fight. See, I've filed 2 lawsuits against you. You can read the details yourself, but long story short, you're about to be financially and legally ruined. Richard grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. Oh, and one more thing, William said casually, taking another sip of his bourbon. You remember the missing HOA funds? Turns out, so does the state attorney. They'll be investigating you for embezzlement. Richard went completely still, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. William smiled, a quiet triumph in his gaze. Now, you can keep pretending you're untouchable, or you can resign before this gets worse. For the first time, Richard had no comeback. The next morning, a formal resignation letter from Richard Langley was sent to every homeowner. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting was held. By evening, Richard Langley was officially removed from the HOA. But William wasn't done yet. He still had one last move to play. The resignation letter was supposed to be Richard's escape plan, a desperate attempt to slip away quietly before the full force of the law caught up with him. But William knew better. This wasn't over, not until Richard faced real consequences for years of fraud, bullying, and abuse of power. As the news of Richard's resignation spread through the neighborhood, homeowners celebrated, their cheers echoing through the streets. Some had been victims of his unfair fines for years, others had almost lost their homes due to his financial extortion. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was hope. But William wasn't celebrating yet. The state attorney's office had already opened an investigation into the missing HOA funds. William had provided all the necessary documents, bank transfers, falsified budgets, irrefutable proof that Richard had used the money to pay off personal debts, lavish vacations, and other luxury expenses. And now it was time for the final blow. The next HOA meeting was the most packed one in years. Homeowners who had never bothered attending suddenly wanted front row seats to Richard Langley's downfall. The interim HOA president, a nervous woman named Linda Carter, took the podium. With Richard Langley's resignation, we will be voting on new leadership. Suddenly, the doors of the clubhouse slammed open, and 2 uniformed police officers strode inside, their eyes scanning the room before heading straight for the front. Murmurs spread across the room, then whispers, then gasps. The officers stopped beside Richard, who had been sitting in the audience, looking pale and disheveled. Richard Langley? One officer asked, his voice firm. Richard slowly stood, his jaw tightening. Yes? You're under arrest for fraud, financial mismanagement, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. The room exploded in noise. Some homeowners cheered, others just watched in stunned silence as Richard was handcuffed right there in the community clubhouse. As the officers led him toward the exit, Richard's eyes locked onto William. William simply raised his glass in a silent toast. Checkmate. With Richard gone, the HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves, their complicity now a glaring liability. Some had been actively involved in Richard's schemes, others had just been too spineless to challenge his tyranny. Either way, their time was up. William presented his detailed findings to the community. Every fine issued in the past 3 years was deemed fraudulent. Homeowners were legally owed refunds. The HOA's bylaws had been illegally altered to favor Richard's control. The result? The HOA collapsed in a landslide vote. The homeowners chose to dissolve the association entirely. The bylaws were written, fines were refunded, and the neighborhood took back control. Just like that, the house of cards Richard had built came crashing down. A month later, William sat on his porch, enjoying the simple pleasure of the afternoon sun warming his face as he admired his fully restored flower bed. No fines, no HOA letters, no power-hungry tyrant trying to control his every move. A few neighbors strolled by, offering waves and grateful nods. He had changed the neighborhood forever. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his journalist contact, Dan Matthews. "Langley took a plea deal. 3 years in prison. Thought you'd like to know." William smirked. Justice had been served. As he leaned back in his chair, a thought crossed his mind: maybe retirement wouldn't be so boring after all. With Richard Langley behind bars, the neighborhood felt newly alive. There were no more surprise fines, no more threats of foreclosure, and no more ridiculous HOA rules being enforced on a whim. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted. Homeowners who once lived in fear of minor infractions now took pride in their properties again. American flags waved freely, security cameras went up without harassment, and for the first time in years, people actually enjoyed their homes. The dissolution of the HOA had been swift. With Richard gone and his former allies scattered like cockroaches in the light, the remaining board members resigned within days of his arrest. The community came together to vote on what would replace the oppressive system, and the decision was unanimous: no HOA. Instead, a simple neighborhood council was formed, focusing only on actual community needs, road repairs, security concerns, and maintaining public spaces. The homeowners, now free from Richard's tyranny, began working together instead of against each other. William watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had fought countless legal battles, but this one felt personal. Despite the victory, William still had one final piece of business to take care of: the refunds. Richard had scammed the community out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines. Many homeowners had been left struggling financially because of his greedy abuse of power. Now that the HOA was gone, their money had to be returned. William worked with a small group of dedicated neighbors to meticulously review every fine issued over the last 5 years. He compiled a detailed list of homeowners who had overpaid or been wrongfully charged, ensuring they received full refunds. For some, it was just a few $100s. For others, it was life-changing. The elderly couple who had been unfairly fined for their garage door received a check for $1,200. The single mother who had been forced to pay for a non-compliant security camera was refunded $500. The military veteran who had almost lost his home over a single fallen branch, he got back every penny Richard had taken from him. For William, this was true justice. It wasn't just the homeowners getting their money back. Richard himself was forced to contribute. As part of his plea deal, the state attorney's office seized his assets: his house, his fancy car, his ill-gotten bank accounts, all liquidated to pay restitution to the very people he had tormented. The same neighbors Richard had threatened now lined up to receive their refunds, watching with satisfaction as his ill-gotten wealth was redistributed. William didn't attend the hearing where Richard was officially sentenced to 3 years in prison. He didn't need to. He had already won. A month later, William sat on his porch, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching as the neighborhood flourished. There were no more passive-aggressive violation letters, no one had to measure their grass with a ruler, and no one had to worry about a power-hungry bureaucrat fining them into oblivion. Instead, people started decorating their homes as they pleased, gardens flourished, and kids played freely in the streets again. One afternoon, as William was tending to his beloved flower bed, A familiar voice called out, "Hey, Judge." He turned to see his neighbor, Tom, grinning as he walked up the driveway. "You hear the latest?" Tom asked, shaking his head with amusement. "Some folks from another HOA, a few miles from here, reached out. They want to know if you'd be willing to help them take down their corrupt board." William chuckled, dusting off his hands. "Guess I've got a reputation now." Tom smirked. "So, you in?" William thought for a moment. He had moved here for peace and quiet, but maybe retirement wasn't meant to be boring after all. He picked up his glass, taking a slow sip. "Tell them," he said with a knowing smile, "I'll take a look at their case." The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with a final thought: valuable lesson. Power in the wrong hands can corrupt, but even the most entrenched tyranny can be toppled by knowledge, perseverance, and a commitment to justice. Never underestimate the power of knowing your rights and standing up for what's right. What's your craziest HOA story? Drop it in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more wild tales of justice.